Erev Tov. This week's parasha is called Tavo, and we're edging towards the end of the book of Deuteronomy. In chapter 26 of the book of Deuteronomy, in the Chumash, we're on page 1141. A number of critical things that we find in Tavo, including a passage that becomes the center of the Passover Haggadah. However, before we get there, I want you to consider the following. If we had to tell, not we, but if Moses had to tell the story of our people in 100 words or less, what would he say? What would he come up with? And apparently there are, at least 4 different versions. So let's look at those versions and see what we can make of them. Again, we're dealing with the story of our people in 100 words or less. So here's the first version. It would go like this: Adam, Seth, Enosh, Canaan, Mahalalel, Yered, Chanoch, Metushelach, Lemach, Noach, Shem, Aparshad, Shelah, Aver, Peleg, Reu, Serug, Nahor, Terach, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. Right? So there we simply have the genealogy from Adam up to Jacob. And then it would continue. The 12 sons of Jacob become the 12 tribes of Israel: Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Joseph, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zvulun. And then in Egypt, over 4 generations, these 12 become a great people. So that's one version, maybe the earliest version, of the Jewish people, where we came from and how we got to ultimately up to Moses. So that's version number 1. Let's look at a second version, the story of our people. It goes like this. Abraham left Ur, came to Canaan, went to Egypt during a famine, returned to Canaan, gave birth to Isaac, who gave birth to Jacob, who fled to Aram after stealing his brother's blessing, returned to Canaan, gave birth to Joseph, who was sold as a slave and brought to Egypt, where he became advisor to Pharaoh, and during another famine brought his family to Egypt, where they were later enslaved, ultimately freed, and then made their way back to the land of Canaan. So that's more Jewishly centered, as opposed to the first version, which takes some 17 generations until we get from Adam up to Abraham. But here's a more personal story of our people as told by Moses. Version 3. Hidden by my mother after birth, placed in a basket on the Nile, found by Pharaoh's daughter, raised in the palace, grew up, killed an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, fled to Midian, married Yitro's daughter, called by God at the burning bush, returned to Egypt, delivered God's message to Pharaoh, let my people go, brought 10 plagues on the Egyptians, led the people through the Sea of Reeds, gave them the Torah at Sinai, led them through the wilderness to the land of our ancestors. Right? So that's Moses as the center of the story, as opposed to the previous one where Abraham and his children are really central. But now, in this week's Torah portion, we have the fourth version of the history of our people. And again, it's well known to us because it's the very center of the Magid section of the Passover Haggadah. So we read as follows. We're in Deuteronomy Chapter 26, beginning with verse 5. And by the way, the background of this is Moses says, when you come to the new land that I'm taking you to, and when you've harvested your food, at the end of the summer harvest, Shavuot, you will bring first fruits in a basket and give a symbolic gift to the Kohanim, the priests in the temple. And you shall repeat this story of the history of the Jewish people. So it goes like this. My father was a wandering Aramean. Aram would be where today Syria is, and Canaan, where ultimately Abraham ends up, where Jacob is born. But Jacob, of course, has to run away, and he heads east, northeast, to try to find Laban and his uncle. And he ends up in Aram and is there for some 20 years. So my father, meaning we Israelites, speaking about not our individual father, but our people's father, Jacob, was a wandering Aramean. He went from here, he went from there, he came back. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers. So, of course, when many years later, when Jacob is told that Joseph is alive, he and the entire family, his 12 sons, his daughter, his grandchildren, they all number 70. And they all head down to Egypt, the only place where there's food. He went down to Egypt with meager numbers and sojourned there. There he became a great and populous nation. So sometime between Jacob, with 70 people all told, and 4 or 5 generations later, when the Israelites leave slavery and Exodus from Egypt, there's 1 million of them. So you get this idea of becoming a great and populous nation. The Egyptians dealt harshly with us and oppressed us. They imposed heavy labor upon us. We cried to the Lord God of our fathers. The Lord heard our plea, saw our plight, our misery, and our oppression. The Lord freed us from Egypt by a mighty hand, by an outstretched arm. Awesome power, signs, and wonders. So that's, in a sense, the story of the Jewish people from Jacob down to Moses and the Exodus, told in, 100 words or less. So that's the 4 different versions. Do we take the big picture? Is it all about Moses? Is it all about Abraham and his children? Is it all about the Exodus and what happened back in those days? So that's the first piece that we're looking at tonight. So let's jump to the next chapter, Deuteronomy chapter 27. And specifically, we look at verse 10, which tells us the following. Heed the Lord your God, observe his commandments and his laws, which I enjoin upon you this day. And then I want you to listen to some of these laws of what you can do, what you can't do. Beginning with verse 15. Cursed be anyone who makes a sculptured or molten image abhorred by the law. Cursed be he who insults his father or mother. Cursed be he who moves his fellow countryman's landmark. Cursed be he who misdirects a blind person. Cursed be he who subverts the rights of the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. Cursed be he who has sex with his father's wife, for he has removed his father's garment. Cursed be he who lies with any beast. Cursed be he who lies with his sister, whether daughter of his father or of his mother. Cursed be he who lies with his mother-in-law. Cursed be he who strikes down his fellow countryman in secret. Cursed be he who accepts a bribe in the case of the murder of an innocent person. Cursed be he who will not uphold the terms of this teaching and observe them. Okay, so there we have the curses that the people were to recite when they ultimately crossed the Jordan and came into the land of Israel. So I'm imagining Moses thinking the following, although he certainly doesn't say it, but he had to have been thinking it. If we assume that the laws are enacted to deal with actual crimes, think about that, right? We don't just sit down and decide, what would be some interesting or good laws to create out of nowhere. You create laws to deal with real situations and real infractions. So if we assume the laws are enacted to deal with actual crimes, and the ritual of the curses that we just read, which are to be recited between Mount Ebal and Mount Gerizim once the people enter the promised land, are an attempt to root out real problems that currently exist in and plague Israelite society, then we must conclude that living amongst us are those who make sculptured or molten images, those who insult and treat with disdain their mothers and fathers, those who move a neighbor's landmark to illegally enlarge their own property, those who on purpose misdirect the blind, those who subvert the justice due the stranger, orphan, or widow, those who have sex with their father's wife, those who have sex with animals, those who have sex with their sister, those who have sex with their mother-in-law, those who strike down their neighbor in secret, those who accept bribes in capital cases. You must conclude the following. You never really know what's going on in the lives of many of the people that you meet. And you wonder, is such a ritual, even one presided over by the Levites, which it was, even one as dramatic as assembling all the nation at the foot of two adjacent mountains, even one that requires all the people to say Amen after each of the curses, is such a ritual capable of creating the kind of nation that we hope to become? So it's a very interesting legal question. Okay, if we create laws because of actual problems, to solve those problems or prevent them, what does that say about the Israelites? We tend to idealize, people who are in the Bible or our own ancestors. But if we're talking about having sex with animals and with your relatives, what does that say about the nature of the Jewish people? And if that is the nature of the Jewish people, that they're going to do these kind of disgusting and horrible things, is a ritual in which you say, cursed be anybody who does this, and you force the people to say Amen, is that really going to do it? Is that really going to improve the ethical nature of these people who are willing to do these terrible things. So, what's the alternative? Severe punishment, hanging people from lampposts as an example to other people? Is it enough to have the ritual? Is it enough to call them out and tell them, you know what? We don't do these kind of things. These are, beyond us. These are terrible. Is that enough? Or is it that the people need to be educated? Is it that the people need to be scared and petrified? Right? So we have a fascinating, philosophical question about the nature of law. Why do we create it? And ultimately, is law capable of changing society? And do we change society by appealing to the better angels of their nature? Or do we change society by scaring people into doing the right thing, fearing the terrible punishments that may fall on them if they don't? So we jump to chapter 28, and there's a long passage that's called the Tochacha, the rebuke. It's a kind of a warning, and it tells about, besides this ritual of the curses following that, it tells us about the terrible things that are going to happen to the Jewish people if they don't, do the right thing, if they don't follow God's laws. This section is one of two sections. There's another one like it in the book of Leviticus called the Tochacha, the rebuke, the warning. And again, we get this sense of trying to scare the bejesus out of people by telling them all the horrible things that God will do to them if they don't obey the Torah. I guess there was the hope that they would learn to do the right thing. By the way, there's a tradition in when you read this passage on Shabbos in the synagogue, the tradition was, number one, that you read it as quickly as possible. Number two, you read it in an undertone, right? Almost that people have to, they don't want to hear the actual words. It's so terrible, all the things that it's going to talk about. Some of those things, the sicknesses that will happen, the destruction of the economy, there won't be rain, there won't be food, the military consequences, the enemy will come in, they will kill your people, enslave you, they will rape your wives and daughters. Because of the hunger, women will end up eating their own children. Right? That's how horrible this section is. So you get the notion as to why we read it quickly and why we read it in an undertone. One other interesting custom is that, usually people fight for an aliyah. And in a big shul, if you don't get an aliyah, you got a chip on your shoulder and you're going to complain about it. Maybe you're going to quit the shul for that reason. Everybody wants an aliyah. And people are counting, how come he got an aliyah? Why not me? And didn't he have one just 3 weeks ago? I haven't had one in 3 months. What's going on? Who do you got to know and who do you got to pay in order to get an honor around here? So Jews were desperate to get an aliyah, except for this aliyah, the aliyah that went with this passage. Nobody wanted to be up there, when the portion that was being read with you standing next to the Torah was, women are going to eat their children, right? It was considered too horrible. So nobody wanted this aliyah. So what did they do? Often they had to pay people to take it. Who would you pay? Maybe the poorest guy. He said, listen, do us a favor. You come up for an aliyah. Okay, it's a bad one. We get that. But we'll pay you for it. And people would do that. Or sometimes it was the shamus. The guy, usually wasn't an honored position in the Jewish community. The guy who put the books away and who made sure there was wine for Kiddush and the Havdalah candle was where it was supposed to be. Those kind of menial chores. The shamus was told, oh, and by the way, one other chore that you have is that you get this aliyah. Right? If you want the job, that's what comes with it. So that was part of the tradition, certainly in the Middle Ages and probably in some Orthodox communities even to this time. So here's what I imagine. Where did this terrible chapter, where did it come from? What was the origin of it? Is it simply that God said, listen, Moses, you tell the people that if they don't do what I'm expecting them, this is what they're going to get, right? The enemy and the famine and disease, etc., etc., etc. And, you could make the case that this comes from God and this is what was really going to happen. Or if we take the point of view that we've got a literary document before us, and it didn't come from God, it came from Moses. And it was Moses' way of writing a law book, a history of the people. So here's how I imagine how Moses might have come up with this terrible chapter. Moses tossed and turned in his sleep, waking Tzipporah, his wife. She watched her husband with deep concern, knowing that he hadn't had a decent night's sleep in weeks. There was so much on his mind, passing through hostile territory, coming closer to the Jordan River and the land promised by God, and the imminent end of his mission and of his life. Suddenly Moses, still asleep, screamed. Tzipporah put her hand on his shoulder. Shh, shh, it's okay. You had a bad dream. I'm right here. Moses sat up in bed, his forehead and his neck and his back covered in sweat. That was the worst nightmare I ever had. I'm shaking. Can you tell me about it? She asked her husband. First, there was a plague. People were dying from consumption, fever, and inflammation. Then there was terrible famine and drought. Our enemies attacked us, and we could do nothing but flee. There were dead bodies all around, and vultures and wolves were tearing them apart and eating them. Survivors ran through the streets afflicted by madness. Wives and daughters were raped before the eyes of husbands and fathers. Enemy warriors plundered our homes and our barns. Young people were being gathered and chained and marched off into slavery and exile. Locusts then attacked whatever the enemy left behind. And the most terrible thing of all, desperate and crazed with hunger, mothers and fathers ate their own children. Moses bowed his head, put his hands to his face, and cried. Tzipporah held her husband. Listen to me, she said. You have to exorcise this nightmare. Get it out of you, or else it will drive you to madness. Here's what I suggest. Get up and get quill and ink and parchment. Write all these things down. Then take the parchment and go and burn it in fire. Once the words are destroyed, the nightmare will be gone. Moses thought for a moment and then turned to his wife. You have a good idea about writing all this down, but we Israelites don't believe in magic like you Midianites do. Burning the parchment won't help. Here's what I will do. I'll use the nightmare as a warning to my people of what could happen to them. And Moses rose and went to his writing implements. And he begins, of course, with, if you do not obey the Lord your God to observe faithfully all his commandments and laws which I enjoin upon you this day, all these curses shall come upon you and take effect. Of course, I hope you noticed that where my coming up with the story really came from. And if you remember, it's the famous scene from Fiddler on the Roof. It's Tevye's dream, or at least his pretending to have this nightmare. And his wife, Golda, says, tell me what you dreamed, I'll tell you what it meant. And in a sense, this is a similar kind of thing. Although this one was probably real. With all the things that were on Moses' mind, he really had a nightmare. It wasn't made up like Tevye's. But like Golda, Tzipporah said, tell me what you dreamt, and I'll tell you what to do. So we have, that's where I get the story from, and imagining where Moses comes up with this terrible chapter 28 of the book of Deuteronomy. So we move now to the Haftarah, and the Haftarah for Tavo is found on page 1160. Remember, this is the Haftarah Shishit Dinechemta, sixth Haftarah of consolation in the cycle of 7, taking us from the destruction of Tisha B'Av all the way to the new beginning of Rosh Hashanah. All of these, as we've said each week, come from Isaiah, who comes to the people in Babylonia, people in exile, around the year 550 BCE, and he's bringing them a message. God has not forgotten you. God still loves us. God will return us to our land, and we will rebuild the temple. So we have that over and over again, right? And then, just a reminder, my approach to the classical prophets and the Haftarahs is that we read them, and it's beautiful language, often that we can't even understand. And my point is, in order to really know what was going on, let's concentrate less on the words and the speech and more on the actions. So all of these are street theater that Isaiah was using to gather a crowd, get their attention, and teach them an important lesson. So first, let's look at some of these words. As beautiful as they are, they're without, a physical meaning to us. They're just speeches. So we quickly get bored. Here's a couple of these verses. Chapter 60, verse 1. Arise, shine, for your light has dawned. The presence of the Lord has shone upon you. Or in verse 6, dust clouds of camels shall cover you, dromedaries of Midian and Ephah. They shall come from Sheba. They shall bear gold and frankincense, and shall herald the glories of the Lord. Or verse 8, who are these that float like a cloud, like doves to their coats? Or verse 18 in chapter 60, where we read the following, the cry, violence shall no more be heard in your land, nor rack and ruin within your borders. And you shall name your walls Victory, and your gates Renown. Or verse 19. No longer shall you need the sun for light by day, nor the shining of the moon for radiance by night. For the Lord shall be your light everlasting. Your God shall be your glory. And then in verse 21, and your people, all of them righteous, shall possess the land for all time. They are the shoot that I planted, my handiwork, in which I glory. So I think we get the sense that there's a lot of beautiful phrases, but what's going on here? What is he really saying? What's the real meaning? And so I use this speech as sort of a way into the street theater that Isaiah performed so that we get a better idea of what he was talking about and how he convinced the people. It was the last night of the month. No moon was visible in the sky. Remember that in Jewish months, the new moon is basically no moon. The middle of the month is the full moon. And then by the end of the month, we have no moon again. The next day is Rosh Chodesh, the new moon, tiniest sliver, if you can even see that. So it was the last night of the month, no moon was visible. In the pitch black, one couldn't see a thing. People were afraid to leave their homes. The next morning, everyone awoke to a thick fog covering the land. You could barely see your hand in front of your face. People were petrified. What's happened to the moon? And what's become of the sun? To many, this was a perfect symbol of the condition of the exiles in Bavel, a nation paralyzed in night and fog. Or was this an omen of even more terrible things to come? The next night was also shrouded in darkness, and on the following morning the thick fog remained. People stayed at home, fearful of venturing out. But suddenly there was the sound of a man crying out, Kumi, Ori, rise and shine. They peered out their windows and were shaken to their core with fear. A ball of fire was moving slowly down the street. What is happening? They screamed to one another. But as the fire passed within a foot or two from where they stood, they saw that it was from the end of a torch that was being carried by the prophet. People began to stream out of their homes and to follow the man with the torch. He led the growing crowd in the town square. Just as you have followed me to this spot, our people will follow God to Zion, and then all the nations of the world will stream into Jerusalem to pay homage to God and to God's people. Caravans of camels will come through the desert. Ships of seafarers will sail to the coast. They will bear gifts of gold and spices. They will bring hordes of sheep to be offered on God's altar. The walls of Jerusalem will be rebuilt, and they will be named Yeshua, salvation, and Tehillah, praise. And then the gates of Zion will never be shut, because pilgrims will never stop coming. Remember, of course, that even, current Jerusalem, with its walls, there are 7 gates, and each gate has a name. There's Jaffa Gate or Damascus Gate, which sort of tell us about the direction that gate will take you to if you follow the road leading out of that gate. But you also have the Gate of Flowers and Lion's Gate, which speak about the decorations that were found on the gates. So just as today, and this probably goes back maybe hundreds, maybe even 1,000 years, The gates had names. So too Isaiah is saying that we will rebuild the city, and the gates will again have special names. This time they'll be called Salvation Gate and Praise Gate. And then the gates of Zion will never be shut. And he says, the time is soon coming when we will no longer need the sun to give us light in the day, and when we will no longer require the moon to illuminate the night. Forget about sunrise and sunset. Forget about the moon waxing and waning. Adonai will be our eternal light. Now, did Isaiah really mean that literally? Day's going to come when there's not going to be a sun and a moon, because it's going to be God's light is going to, brighten everything up 24/7? Or was this just a metaphor? More likely the latter. One of the people in the crowd turned to the man standing next to him and said, "If only." The prophet stepped toward that man and answered, "Ani Adonai be'ita achashishena." And God said, when the time comes, I will bring it quickly to pass. So notice what's happening. Isaiah, the street performer, hears what one of the spectators says, and he immediately plays on that. And the guy makes a point, yeah, it would be wonderful, but is it really going to happen? And Isaiah uses that moment to ad-lib and to improvise. I, God, will bring it about. Suddenly, it seemed to grow brighter outside. The fog was burning off. The sun was making its first appearance in days. People gazed at the heavens. When they turned back to look at the prophet, he was gone. Right? He made his speech, he made his point, and the people understood it. Was it just the sun that burned off the fog, or was that God, who was making the point that everything that Isaiah just said is quickly going to happen? You can imagine that the people among themselves were debating and arguing that very point. No, it wasn't God. It was simply, it was, the sun. It was a natural thing, happens all the time. Or other people said, no, can't be a coincidence. Moment after he says it, and then it happens, it's clearly God showing his power. So those are some of the teachings and the lessons that we have in Tavo this week. We'll continue in a little bit at 8:30 with Mari.